It is the 21st century and it has never been easier to get into video games. You basically have 3 home consoles to choose from. You've got 2 options for handheld consoles, even if one of them is a bit rubbish, not going to say which one, it's the Vita. And if you want to, you can play games right there on your phone. Oh, but it wasn't always that simple, was it? No, during the 90s, do you remember the 90s? I only ask because no one seems to mention that particular decade on the internet. Anyway, the 90s gave us a plethora of consoles available from a number of manufacturers.
Not counting major consoles, the 90s saw the release of the Neo Geo, the Neo Geo Pocket, the FM Towns, the Laser Active, the CDI, the 3DO, the Jaguar, the PCFX, the Pippin, the Turbo Express, the Game Master, the Mega Duck, the Gamecom, and the Wonderswan, to name almost all of them.
That is a lot of consoles, difficult for a young child or an ailing grandmother to navigate. You might get annoyed come Christmas when your nan gets you the Wii version of a game you don't want when the only system you have is an Xbox One, but imagine getting a game you don't want for a system you've never even heard of.
But nestled among this deluge of half-assed systems was a CD-based console from a hardware company that had quite the success in the games market during the 80s and early 90s. That company was Commodore, and that system was the Amiga CD32. Released in Europe in September of '93 and promoted by a commercial in which the guy from News Radio watches as a giant robot brain is overwhelmed by the sheer processing power of 90s computer technology, the CD32 was a successor of sorts to the Amiga CD-TV, which was more multimedia focused but less successful. Most of those consoles from the 90s were half-assed cash grabs, and for a while it looked like the CD32 would break that streak. CD32 games were the best-selling CD-based games media in the UK for a few months after the system's launch. But the console didn't even make it to its first birthday before a patent lawsuit led to Commodore aborting the US release of the console and ultimately filing for bankruptcy in 1994.
CD32 support sort of stopped at that point because it's difficult to support a system when the manufacturers died the sort of death usually reserved for poorly run internet startups, but during its brief lifespan, the CD32 enjoyed a robust library of games that Amiga fans would love, mostly because they'd already played them on the Amiga.
The CD32 was essentially an Amiga 1200 with a CD-ROM drive welded to the side, so porting games across from the Amiga was a relatively easy affair, as evidenced by the masses upon masses of shovelware titles crapped out for the thing. More than half of the CD32's library consisted of Amiga titles from the preceding 4 years, and most developers couldn't even be bothered to tweak the games to make them more console-friendly, such as, remapping jump from up on the joystick to one of the console gamepad's 6 buttons. They couldn't even be bothered to do that. Really, the most you could expect from a CD32 port would be a hastily animated opening FMV sequence and, if you were lucky, a remastered soundtrack. James Pond 2 for the CD32 had both of these, and the soundtrack is actually fantastic, though the opening FMV was clearly intended for the 3rd game in the series, though it's perhaps better off here because James Pond 3 was, to put it mildly, a bit crap.
Plus it was animated by a little studio called Cosgrove Hall, who are the guys behind Count Duckula and Danger Mouse, so that's something.
Most of these ports were a spectacular waste of the CD format, case in point Frontier Elite 2, which fit onto a single floppy disk for the Amiga release and was released more or less unmodified for the CD32. No new features, no CD audio, just 2 megabytes worth of data slapped onto a CD capable of holding almost 400 times that. Then there's the CD32 version of Lemmings, which is literally just the Amiga CD-TV port with brand new packaging. I mean, they didn't change anything. That is a staggering level of laziness. But it's not all bad news. There were a handful of really great games that took full advantage of the console's CD capabilities. Some of these games were point-and-click adventures like Beneath a Steel Sky, which, unlike the floppy disk-based Amiga version, features a full cast of voice actors, and Simon the Sorcerer, which also features voice acting and stars Red Dwarf's very own Chris Barry in the lead role.
I want to be a wizard.
You, a wizard?
What do you mean?
Then there were games developed specifically with the CD32 in mind, games like 3D shoot-'em-up Microcosm, which was a port of the FM Towns original, The Misadventures of Flink, which is brilliant but shockingly not quite as good as the Sega CD version, and last but absolutely not least, Liberation Captive 2, an open-world sci-fi noir detective game that to this day I have absolutely no idea how to play, but it features impressive audio, an expansive, fully explorable game world, and voice acting from the likes of none other than Bob the Builder himself, Neil Morrissey.
Nah, you don't want to believe all that stuff you're hearing. Kid was a little dreck kid from the word go, to my way of thinking.
Well, that's just rude.
Liberation is massive, with a beautiful score and some surprisingly good voice acting, though it's best played with a mouse rather than the CD32's gamepad. It's also probably the only game that was ported to the Amiga from the CD32. A version was released for regular Amiga computers, coming on no less than 5 floppy disks and featuring an incredibly stripped down version of the game. This wasn't just missing the fancy voice acting and CD audio, but featured a significantly smaller game world.
Interesting fact, Liberation's 5 discs isn't anywhere close to being the most floppies for an Amiga game. Monkey Island 2 had 11 and Rise of the Robots had 13, but the record goes to the German exclusive Bing Sex, Intrigue and Scalpel, or Sex, Intrigue and Scalpels, a porny hospital simulator which came on a preposterous 19 floppy disks. 19! Now there's a game that could have done with a CD32 port. I don't have a tag for this.
A couple of developers were clearly keen on the hardware but lost interest as its market share waned. Developers like Gremlin Interactive, who knocked out an impressive port of their cartoon puzzle adventure Little Devil, as well as an updated port of Zool, Ninja of the Nth Dimension, which was a critical and commercial hit on the Amiga as well as on other systems like the Sega Genesis. But the CD32 version of its sequel is just a disappointing phoned-in copy-paste port.
Ultimately, the CD32 was a bit of a disaster, albeit one that was well marketed. And had Commodore not gone tits up, it's entirely possible the console could have continued to become more and more successful. Except, that's a lie, because we're talking about a console based on outdated technology that was struggling to keep up with the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, with a library of years-old ports of games everyone had already played to death. And with the Japanese launch of the PlayStation a little over a year after the CD32's debut, well, do I even have to make the joke? At the end of the day, the CD32 was always doomed to be just another 90s console failure, but it did give us a couple of neat ports, so I count that as a win. Even if it's, not an actual win. I mean, really, it's a massive, massive failure for everyone. I mean, how many companies invested in developing games for the CD32? I mean, I bet people lost their jobs over this. Obviously, people at Commodore lost their jobs because, they went bankrupt, but, still. Bye.
It's a cracking little game that has you exploring large levels, rescuing British biscuit mascots, and ultimately saving Christmas, just like the real RoboCop and or James Bond.
I mean, if I want to kill someone with a shotgun, I want to be close enough to see the light in their eyes go out. Which is, difficult enough as it is, considering that most of these guys do not have heads.
Every debate in this movie is played so perfectly. It pains me how little respect this film has gotten in the grand scheme of sci-fi. The human race rests on their shoulders. They are pragmatic, but rarely in agreement. This is no more clear than in the debate about changing their trajectory to stop by the Icarus 1 to take their payload and theoretically double their chances in succeeding in their mission.